All right, so welcome everyone to our 201 session. We are now recording. Let me stop sharing this screen and I will pull up our guide and we'll walk through the critical elements that we're going to tackle this week. Okay, so this is where we left off last week. This is the end of the price elasticity of demand section. So you'll notice that right from there, we move into the next section of the final project for our Milestone 3. So Milestone 3 is going to cover the last 3 sections of the final paper. So cost of production, which you can see here on the screen, overall market, and the recommendation section. At this point, you're going to be putting together the rest of your paper. So after you complete Milestone 3, and assuming you've completed Milestones 1 and Milestones 2, your paper will be done in draft form. You will have completed all of the elements that you need to complete. Obviously, you'll want to go back and make some edits based on your instructor's feedback and anything that you've learned throughout the experience that you want to go back and add to previous parts of your paper as you've expanded some of this, especially as you think about your recommendations. You want to make sure that those recommendations are aligned with everything you talked about in your paper. So if you have an idea for your company and you didn't really flesh out the basis for that idea in one of the previous sections, like your supply and demand section, that might be a time where you go back in and add it. But after this milestone, you've really done the vast bulk of your work. So it should be a big load off your back and, feel like you've accomplished something. So that's what I hope everyone's feeling after the end of this week. All right, so the first section, cost of production, has 2 critical elements in it. And the first one is asking you to analyze the various costs your company faces, their trends over time, and how they've impacted the company's profitability. So those are the 3 things that you want to make sure that you hit on to really get an exemplary for the final project. Now remember, both the guides, whether you're looking just at the milestone guide or you're looking at the final project guide, they're identical. They're just broken into sections for the milestones. They do have the final project rubric in mind. So if you really want to just hit this out of the park from the get-go, you want to make sure that you hit all 3 of those things to get full credit. Even on the milestone as well, you'll want to make sure that you cover all these 3 things. So you're going to look at the various costs your company faces. That's going to be slightly different for every company. Every company has costs, but of course they're not going to be the same because everyone's inputs are different depending on the product or service that you're producing. The trends of those over time. So you're going to know from the company's annual report what their overall costs are doing. We talk about that a little bit below, but you can also look at more generally how the costs of their inputs are trending. So if we look at the example of Coca-Cola, one of their major inputs is high fructose corn syrup, or sugar. No, they use high fructose corn syrup. I think in Mexico they still use plain sugar, but that's one of their major inputs for to make Coca-Cola. So you might look at the trend of that good. Starbucks, a really obvious example, is coffee beans. Netflix might be licensing fees for the content that they provide to their members online. For an automobile company, it might be something like steel and various other things. Those are just one example per company. But so if I were, let's say, doing an automotive company, I might look at the trend in steel pricing over the past 5 or 10 years. Are steel prices going up? Are they going down? Are aluminum prices going up or going down? What about tires? What about glass? What about labor? How are all those things moving, all those inputs that go into making my product, in this case a car, how are those changing over time? And then you're going to obviously have the company's own costs to look at, where everything is aggregated together. They're not necessarily going to break it down for you by, well, this is how much we spent on steel, and this is how much we spent on tires, but they'll be able to tell you overall how their costs were moving. So you can talk about individual costs, like I just mentioned, steel prices moving, coffee bean prices moving, but then you're also going to look at COGS overall. It's usually called that in most annual reports for cost of goods sold. And again, that's all the costs aggregated together for each year. So you'll be able to see how that moves in total. So if you see costs moving up or costs moving down, you'll be able to explain why they're moving that way. And that's how you get to the how does this impact the company's profitability part. So sometimes you'll see, okay, well, costs are going up year after year. Gosh, is this company losing money? Well, not necessarily. Maybe costs are going up because they're just producing a lot more. If I'm making more cars, I'm definitely going to be spending more on steel. So of course my costs are going to go up, but it doesn't mean that necessarily my profit is going down. If my revenues are increasing faster than my costs, then the rising costs are just a reflection of either increased production or I'm able to increase my price enough that even if I produce the same amount, my costs are going up, but I can sell my product at an even higher price and my profit margin stays just as high as it was. So that's really what a lot of students tend to miss is the profitability piece. If you just look at the costs, you won't really be able to answer the profitability question. You have to look at the costs and then compare them to revenue, which you already have collected. You already have all that information to tell a profitability story. All right. Oh, I'm sorry you guys lost my sound. I'm not sure if that came through on the recording either. The same thing happened last week. That's so bizarre. I wonder if it's my connection here or my dog barking. So the big thing is to keep, oh, it keeps coming in and out. The big thing here is to make sure that you touch on each three of these, that you talk about some of the specific costs the company has, how those costs have moved over time, look at the overall cost trend for the company for the past 5 or more years, and then take that one step further to look at the bottom line, the profitability of the company, where you have to compare costs and revenue. And that's all in the annual report in terms of the profitability piece. So the part that you'll be mostly researching here are the costs, the inputs and the costs of those inputs and how they've been trending. All right, any questions on this one? Okay. So you want to move along so we don't take up too much time. So Mark asks about including the milestone. That's up to you, Mark. Your instructor is only going to read and grade these critical elements that you're being graded on this time. So if you made any edits to old ones, don't expect to get feedback or new grades or anything on the old stuff because they just are looking at this piece. So that's up to you. All right. So the second element in this section is asking you to apply the concept of variable and fixed costs to the company for informing their output decisions. So you've already thought a little bit about the input costs for your company. So some of those input costs are going to be variable and some of them are going to be fixed. And depending on their mix of variable and fixed costs is going to influence how they decide to grow and increase their production or decrease their production. Because with a variable cost, every time you produce something new, it incurs a new cost. Whereas a fixed cost, just like the name would imply, it's fixed at least in some set time frame. We do learn that in the long run, all costs are variable because you can always change them. But if you're planning a year budget or even a 5-year budget as a company, some costs are going to be fixed. So you want to make sure that you spread those costs out over enough output so that you're not making a loss on those items. So depending on how that balance is faced for the company is going to inform what they do. So a company like Starbucks might wonder, should we open a new location? Or how many new locations should we open in Europe this year? Opening a new store is a big fixed cost. They have to make sure that they get enough traffic through the door. If they want to offer a new menu item, let's say they want to offer lunch sandwiches, they would have to consider, okay, well, what's the variable cost of what goes into making those lunch sandwiches, and will I be able to make up that cost when I sell it? So it plays a very different role depending on if it's a variable or a fixed cost. So you're going to explore that a little bit to see how they're making certain decisions in terms of how much to produce or what to produce. All right. So Tammy asks, all this information is the information you've provided per their company with their reports. So Tammy, The reports that are provided in the class are just a jumping off point, and they're from 2015. So you should definitely get the 2016 report, and maybe even you might want to look at older reports too, just to compare how things have changed for the company over time. Remember, you're not reading the whole thing. You're just looking at the data on the financials. And by financials, I mean the costs and the revenue section, and their business overview section. So you're not reading all the stuff about stocks and shareholders and all that stuff. You can skip over all that. So I know that they're really long, but generally you're going to stick to a very small portion of it. And then you can also look beyond that. You know, sometimes a simple Google search will reveal a lot of this. If you want to look at a company's plans to expand, or the opposite, if they need to scale down. You know, you hear about automotive manufacturers closing factories. Obviously, they're looking at variable and fixed costs when they look into that. And all of that stuff you can just find in news reports, and that's absolutely fine to use, or industry magazines. If you can't find it through a simple web search, a lot of the times we have access to those journals through the Shapiro Library. So that's an option that I really hope all students at least try to use a little bit in this course. So Marie Sheridan asks if COGS can be revenue costs. That sounds probably like what they're referring to. Yeah, Marie. If you're unsure at all, and so it might break it down below that, like to the what kinds of costs. But if you're unsure, you can take a screenshot of it and send of the whole chart. Usually it's in like a table format in the annual report, and send it to your instructor, and they can verify that for you. All right. So that is our cost section. It's just those two elements. So you're looking at costs and their trends and how it impacts profit, and output decisions informed by different variable and fixed costs that the company faces. All right, so the next section is overall market. Now, this section can be a little bit tricky. So Patsy, I'm sorry, did I miss your question about there's a question in the chat for those listening to the recording. I'm not sure if Ellen looks like you may have gotten it. So we can, because we do have a few more elements to go over, I'll let Ellen handle that. Thank you, Ellen. So the first one in overall market is to discuss the market share for your company and its top competitors by providing details on current percentages for each company and describing the trend over time. So a couple of things going on here. First, what is market share? A lot of students confuse this with share price of like the stock, so their stock price. That's not what it refers to at all. Market share is the piece of the pie of this industry that your company gets in terms of revenue typically. So let's say that the sneaker industry is, I'm just going to throw out a number, $5 billion a year. The worldwide sneaker industry. That's how much people across the world every year spend on sneakers, or the past year. Now let's say Nike has $1 billion of that, $1 billion of the $5 billion, just in sneaker sales. We would say that their market share in the sneaker industry is 1 out of the 5 billion, or 20%. That would be their market share. Those numbers are not accurate. I just made those up. But you'll be able to find this out for your company. First, you have the revenue for your company. Now, if you're looking at a specific market and your company is in a lot of different markets, when you look at their revenue, it's going to be the revenue for everything all together. So for the Nike example, when you look at Nike's revenue, that's their sneakers, that's all their apparel, that's all their sporting equipment, all added up together. Some companies aren't in tons of different markets like that. They might just be in one, like let's say like a Netflix, or if you just wanted to say automobile sales, it's much easier to look at a company like Ford or even Tesla, or what else is on the list? We have GM on the list as well. So the revenue that you see in the line, just keep in mind that that's for the entire company, and they might be in more than one market. Like, Apple makes a lot of money on iPhones. Most of their about half their revenue comes from iPhone typically, but that means 50% of the rest of their stuff comes from computers and iPads and other things that they make. You should be able to find, in doing your research, either just through a web search or through the Shapiro Library resources, the size of the overall market. So how much do people spend on sneakers? How much do people spend on sporting goods? Or how much do people spend on laptop computers? Or how much do people spend on automobiles in a year? And then you can find what your company does and just make a percentage from that. A lot of the times the stuff has already been calculated by somebody and researched by somebody, and it's out there, and you can absolutely just borrow their research and of course cite it and put it directly into your paper that way as well. The key thing here is that we do want to see a trend over time. So you're going to need at least 2 years. 5 years might be difficult to do for some industries, but if you have 2 data points, like let's say you have information for 2016 and you also found information from 2014, you can say, okay, over these 2 years, did my company's market share go up or did it go down? And that will at least indicate a direction for the trend. All right, looks like we've got some questions in the chat, but my wonderful sidekicks are answering them. Thank you, Kate and Ellen. I did mention Tesla, and so I saw a question about that. In that instance, the relevant market would be electric cars. You might also want to speak to the overall automobile market, but certainly compare them to the specific electric car market as your focus in that instance. All right, so that's market share. And to make sure that you, again, this is for the final draft to get a full credit on the final draft, but if you're getting the data now, it makes sense just to aim for that final goal here. You do need to put it in some sort of graphical form. Obviously, a pie chart makes the most sense. So if you've got 2 years worth of data for market share for your company and a couple of, their top couple competitors, you can show that, 1 year in a pie and then the other year in a pie, and then talk about the direction of it. That's one way to do it. Other charts could work too, but because it's a percentage, pie charts make a lot of sense in this case. But to get full credit, you do need to show it graphically. All right, so the second rubric element is asking you to look at barriers to entry. So this is covered a bit in chapter 14 it is covered in chapter 14, which I believe is unfortunately not actually assigned reading. It's a small part of chapter 14, but it's not assigned reading until next week. So it does require you to jump ahead just a little bit. This, again, it's a very small section. And we've got the link here to the video to introduce you to it. I think it would be wise to watch this video from the textbook to go over the concept, and then you can skim through that stuff in the textbook after you've watched the video, and that should help it sink in a little bit better. So basically, the barriers to entry are outlined in our textbook. They are things that keep potential competitors to your company. So not what keeps your company out of a particular business, but what keeps potential competitors out. So if you are an automotive company, what's keeping a bunch of people from starting their own automotive companies and competing with you? If you are Starbucks, what's keeping other people from making their own coffee houses and competing with you? That's what the barriers to entry would be. So some industries are going to have higher barriers to entry than others. And you'll discuss what those barriers are, how high they are, for lack of a better term, or how strong those barriers are, and what that means for your company in terms of potential competition in the future. So Lisa asks, are government regulations a barrier to entry? Yep, absolutely. So a lot of legal things like patents are a barrier to entry, for instance. So that would be sort of a government regulation because it's a law. Other government regulations, especially around things like alcohol, tobacco, firearms, those are heavily regulated industries that you can't just break into. So if I wanted to just make beer in my basement, which I've done, I can't just sell it just because I can. But it might be much easier if I made lemonade in my basement to sell that. I might still need to get a license, but that license might be much easier. Even something like hairdressing, people need to get a license to do that business, and that is it might not be a very high barrier because maybe getting that license isn't terribly difficult, but it's still a barrier. I can't just open the door to my house and say, okay, I'm cutting hair for $10 and let people come in. I could get in trouble for that. So certainly government regulations can play a role. All right, so that's barriers to entry. I would definitely, again, just look through, watch the video, check out that small section of chapter 14, and they've gone through. It's just a handful of specific categories of barriers to entry. You know, they're broad categories, like the government regulation one that Lisa mentioned, and then think about how that applies to your specific industry. Okay, what government regulation might there be in my industry, or what resource might there be in my industry that I wouldn't be able to get, a competitor might not be able to get access to because it's just difficult to source. So you can go through them and see how it might apply, or if it doesn't apply, you can explain why not. All right, so the last rubric element in this section is for you to describe the market structure for your firm and analyze how this affects their ability to influence the overall market. So this week, we're covering 2 of the 4 market types. One is perfect competition, which most of your companies will not be, because perfect competition assumes that your products are exactly identical. So think of like the corn that goes into making high fructose corn syrup. They just gather it up from hundreds, maybe thousands of farmers. They put it all together. Literally, they bring it to a depository. Well, all these different farmers bring their corn, and they put it in this place, and then it goes off to be made into high fructose corn syrup, for instance. All that corn that went into it is treated as identical. So you can't have your own brand, so to speak. Because we're doing companies that we've heard of, for the most part, they all have a brand and they're all trying to differentiate themselves in some way. So by definition, they wouldn't be perfect competition. The other one that we're studying this week is monopolistic competition. And then there's 2 more that we're going to cover in more detail next week. Oligopoly, where there are just a handful of companies that dominate the market. And then monopoly, which we're probably more familiar with, where there's one company that 100% controls the market, or for all intents and purposes controls the market. So there are some times when if a company has maybe near 100%, but not quite 100%, economists might still refer to it as a monopoly. So like Microsoft, in terms of their like Windows operating system, not as much anymore, but back then when they were very dominant, that would be an example of a near monopoly, where it's not quite 100%, but it's so big that they almost act like a monopoly. So if you have an inclination that you might have an oligopoly, and you can sort of tell, and here in the guide, we talk about, there's a table where it lists the characteristics of each of the market types, so you can get a sense of, okay, where do I think this industry that my company is in falls? Do I think that there's a lot of competitors? Do I think that they differentiate their products? Do I think that there's just a few competitors? Are there high barriers to entry? Is it really easy to enter this market? Those are the kinds of things that are included in that table that will help you determine, or at least get a thought of, it's probably this or it's probably that. If you think that yours is an oligopoly or maybe even a monopoly, feel free to read ahead on those chapters. If you think yours is monopolistic competition, then we're covering that this week. So it really depends on where you think you end up. Once you've done that and you sort of have an idea of which category you fall into, you can use some more mathematical methods to figure it out. So the most common one is the 4-firm concentration ratio, which we've linked to here to how to calculate that. And that can really help you decide if you're on the fence, I'm not really sure if my company is in monopolistic competition or if they're in an oligopoly. You doing that for firm concentration ratio might help you out. And there's another calculation called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index that's a little bit more complicated to do. But if you have the data, it might be interesting to see what it gives you. And that's another way to help determine the concentration of the market. So the table is in your textbook, tells you the name and what page it's on. So, but we've shared it with the group as I think just as a picture, just so it can be shared more easily in announcements if your instructor's done that. Thanks, Ellen. Ellen's gonna share it out for anybody who's looking, but there's the page number if anyone's looking for it. It's pretty basic. Although we could probably link to it in this as well now that I have it in a JPEG. I will try to remind myself to update this and include it there. So the last, this is the last element before you get into the recommendation. So once you've determined, okay, this is my market structure, and you have to come out and say it. This is the market structure that my firm is in. Then you have to say, okay, well, these are the reasons why I believe it fits that category. And then discuss your firm's ability to influence the market. So obviously, if you're a monopoly, you have a big influence in the market because you totally dominate it. In an oligopoly, as you'll read about, there's a little bit of interdependence between the firms because there's just a few of them or a couple of them dominating, and they really have to play off of each other. In monopolistic competition, there are so many firms that they take a slightly different approach, usually in finding a niche where they can really stand out among their competitors and offer something unique and let somebody else offer a different unique thing. They don't necessarily compete head to head on all the little things. So it's a slightly different ball game depending on what kind of market you're in, and that's what we're looking for you to explore. All right, so the last section is your recommendation section. So we only have a few minutes left. This is the fun part, I think, and I think students generally do a pretty good job of this, where you're gonna take what you've learned, take all that you've analyzed, and use it to make some specific recommendations for the firm. So it is 3 separate critical elements. I do want to keep that in mind, and I think to keep yourself organized and to help your instructor recognize the 3 different pieces, it does help to keep them in separate, at least separate paragraphs. Some of them might have more than 1 paragraph, but if they're all separated, then it's easy for your instructor to know that you've hit on each one. But the first element here is asking you to develop a recommendation for how the firm can manage its future production by synthesizing the data presented. So in future production, that's asking you to sort of go back to your analysis in the cost section and in the supply and demand section to have a recommendation that has to do with their future production. Maybe it means doing something to control input costs because that's a concern. Maybe it means doing something on the supply side in terms of a technological improvement or just increase in production in order to take advantage of something like economies of scale. There's lots of, this is very open-ended, but this element is really asking you to focus on the production side of things. The second element is asking you to suggest how the firm's position within the market and among its competitors will allow it to take the recommended action. So if you're going to say, okay, I think my firm should do X, Y, or Z, how will they be able to do that based on their position in the market? If they're growing in the market, if they're losing market share in the market, if they're dominant in their market, if they're a niche player, what does that mean for them and their ability to act on what you've suggested? So obviously a more powerful company or a company with a better brand recognition might have more options open to them. So those are the kinds of things that you can think about as you address that question. And lastly, this third critical element in the recommendation section is asking you to describe how the firm can sustain its success going forward by evaluating trends in demand and price elasticity. So this is, you don't necessarily have to give a whole new recommendation, although a lot of students do, and that's okay. But it really wants you to go back to that first milestone, your second milestone, and look at the section in the trends and demand, which is overall demand in the market. You know, what are people looking for? How are their preferences changing? How are population and demographics playing a role? That sort of stuff that's overall, not necessarily specific to just your firm, but all the firms in the market. And price elasticity. So if you look at those two things, you can talk a little bit about, okay, well, these are how trends are changing. So this is where I see the company having to go to stay in line with those trends. And then on the price elasticity side, speaking to their pricing strategy, which you already explored a little bit, and this just gives you a chance to work that into your recommendation for them moving forward. So do make sure that you cover both of those for this element to get full credit. James asks, how do you write the reference for a 10K annual report in APA? James, that's a great question. Honestly, I would have to look it up myself. I use the resources that are provided when I do my own citations. I don't have APA memorized, so I think your best bet is to use any of the links provided in the course for APA, or some other web links that students are really fond of, like Citation Machine or Cite This For Me. And you know, of course, our Writing Center has lots of great ones too. That's probably the best. Yeah, Purdue OWL. I don't know if they have a specific listing for 10K, but they might. Yeah, and if I wonder, you know, that might be, I don't know if the library answers that kind of question, but the library does have a 24/7 chat, and they might be able to help with that. I'm not sure if they want you to go to the Writing Center for that and not the library, but it's worth a shot. If if you're working at like 11 o'clock at night and you just want an answer. But honestly, usually if you Google that, APA citation, annual report, or 10K, I would think it would pop up. Yeah. So if you can't find it in any of the links in the classroom, you can try the chat in the library, or just a Google search. All right, we are a couple minutes over. And I know we've probably got some 202 students on the line that are very patiently waiting. So if 201 students have any more questions, feel free to get them up now. Otherwise, best of luck. I'm sure you all do wonderful. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming and for your great questions. Terrific. Okay, thank you guys. Have a great night. And 202 folks, thank you so much for coming and for giving us a few extra minutes. They had a very long milestone this week. Yours is much shorter, so we might not need all of the half hour. Yes, so Jim C. asked if this recording is going to be available on the YouTube page. Yes, I usually get it posted. I have to convert the video, so it's not super fast. But usually I have it up by about 9 o'clock in the morning on the YouTube page, Eastern time. And then we'll send out that link, but you can get the link from here on the home screen for this page as well. Or if you've bookmarked it or followed it, the channel. All terrific options. All right, so 202 students, we're going to pull up your guide and get going. Okay, so this is where we left off last time on the fiscal policy, and moving right on into, I doubled that slide, sorry about that, to monetary policy. So this week you are being introduced to monetary policy. So I realize it's early in the week and you might not have done all the reading yet, which I totally understand. The good news is that you'll notice a lot of similarities between fiscal policy and monetary policy in terms of their goals. the mechanisms are different, the tools that they have available to them are different, and that's where we're going to spend the most of our time focusing in terms of this first slide, thinking about what those tools are. But in terms of our explanation of how those things work, we're going to use the same models. So I probably bored you to death last time. Not really. I don't think it's okay. All right, I'm back. I know that I just lost my connection. Can people hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you. So sorry. So hopefully you've started reading about monetary policy, but if you haven't, I totally understand. That's fine. We'll talk a little bit about what it is. So monetary policy is the Federal Reserve, so our central bank's ability to influence the economy mainly through the money supply. So whereas fiscal policy influenced the economy through things like spending, government spending, and taxation, this uses the money supply and usually through interest rates, but they have a few other tools available as well to have an impact on the economy. Mainly, their 4 goals are listed here: price stability, so inflation, controlling inflation, not letting it get too high, and these days, not letting it stay too low. Employment, so they want to keep employment high. And then secondary to that, economic growth and financial market stability. But usually they're looking at things like price level and wage levels, how fast or how slow those are increasing, and employment levels. So employment levels is sort of what we're used to, just, what's the unemployment rate, but they also look at some more nuanced views if you dig a little bit deeper into those unemployment numbers to see how things are going. But at a very high level, that's what they look at for the most part. Now, the main tools for the Fed are adjusting the money supply, mainly through open market operations. They can change the required reserve ratio, change the discount rate, things like that. You may have heard even recently, especially in the wake of the Great Recession, something called quantitative easing, or QE. That's another more newer tool that they have in their toolbox. We're not going to necessarily go into all the detail about that right here tonight, because that would take a lot of time, and that's all spelled out in your textbook. And quite frankly, if I was going to give you guys a lecture on that, I would have a lot of other stuff to go with it. So definitely spend some time with your textbook. And there's other, lots of great YouTube videos that I know that I like to share with my class. So if your instructor hasn't yet shared any additional resources to supplement what's in our textbook, you can find some great ones too, and we've got some here as well. But once you get a handle on what monetary policy is, then you can sort of speak to what monetary policy was like at the start of your decade. So just like with our fiscal policy milestone, this is following the same pattern. So you're going to talk about in this first critical element, usually it's just one slide for this one, what monetary policy looked like at the start of your decade. So where were interest rates by the Fed set at? Was that an increase from the previous one, or was that a decrease? So were they trending down or trending up? And what was the reason why? So the Fed meets on a very regular basis. They don't always change their the Fed funds rate, or their target rate, but they often do. It really depends on, they look at what the economy is doing and they decide if they need to adjust it up or adjust it down. And so you're going to look at what they had just done at the start of your decade. Depending on how active they were in that realm, you might have to go back a year or so, but see what their most recent decision was in terms of setting that rate and why they came to that decision. So that's what we'll talk about here. And you can also talk about the tools that they use. So they might have a target rate, but what tools did they employ to get there? And that's all available from the Fed website. They've got, and yes, we have the link here, transcripts of meetings and other historical materials. So this last bullet point has that. You can type in the year that you're looking for, and you can skim through their minutes and see, hey, they decided to take these actions to have a different target rate. This is what they did, and you've got it right there for you. So it's a wonderful resource. The San Francisco Federal Reserve is another great resource that's more researching Federal Reserve history. So a slightly different approach, whereas the transcripts is more just, this is what we did, and this is when we did it. All right, Carissa says, I keep cutting out. Gosh, I'm really sorry, guys. This was happening earlier too. I'm not sure if it's my connection or the fact that I have about 1,000 things open on my computer. Could be that. I'll try to cut down on that stuff so I'm not working up all my bandwidth. Okay. Maybe this will be a little bit better. All right, so that's your first slide. Again, this usually for most students is just one slide because you're just talking about really the Fed's most recent decision making and actions. And so you've set the stage there, you've explained why they came to that decision, and then you can go into the next critical element, which is asking you to look at, just like before with fiscal policy, the monetary policy actions throughout the decade. So again, depending on how active the Fed was during your decade, they might have a lot of changes. They're really active in adjusting that their target rate. And of course, that has a ripple effect throughout the economy. When they change their target rate, that changes lots of people's expectations, and it changes the interest rates that you get at your bank and on your credit card and for your mortgage and all that stuff. So the more they change it, each of those is its own separate action because it has effects throughout the economy. So depending on how active they are, you might have more to talk about. So you might need more than one slide here, depending on what that looks like for your time period. But you'll want to, just like before, you'll want to talk about the choices they made and how the models can explain that choice. So if the Fed is using expansionary policy, so they want to increase the money supply in that case, they've got different tools to do that, like we talked about, to increase the money supply. Why is increasing the money supply expansionary policy? How does that help them reach their goal of more economic growth or higher employment, or in these days, higher price increases? We usually think of that as a bad thing, but they do have a target inflation rate. Right now it's about 2%. So if we're below that, they want to sort of expand the economy and get it moving a little bit stronger and faster. So why would increasing the money supply do that? Why would it help any of those things? That's what our models are there to explain. So if you can use our models, then we've got a couple here. You see our ADAS model is back. Supply and demand of money model, that one can also help because that connects the money supply to the interest rate. And then interest rate is what comes into play in your aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So if you can understand or explain in these slides, okay, well, if the Fed increases the money supply, this is what it does to interest rates. And then when interest rates move in that direction, this is what happens to aggregate demand, because if interest rates are lower, businesses can invest more and people may buy more homes and cars and spend more on their credit cards and things like that. So those are the ways that you're using models to explain the actions, or at least the thinking behind the actions. All right, I see some people typing. Okay. So Tammy asked, where are we using all of this? I apologize for missing it. So I'm not sure if that was before, but that might have been an old question. Okay, so Krista asks if I can re-explain the model info because I cut out. Yeah, that's no problem. We've got time. So the models are here for you to employ, so you can explain the actions the Fed took. So let's say the Fed is trying to implement some sort of expansionary monetary policy, like we have in the example here. So they are doing that by increasing the money supply. So the supply and demand of money, that model, explains how the money supply, an increase or a decrease, affects interest rates. So if you click on this link, I believe it's a video from our textbook, and this is spelled out in our textbook as well, if you prefer to read. So that shows it looks a lot like a supply and demand model. I mean, it is a supply and demand model, but it's for money. That shows you how an increase in the money supply will affect interest rates and how a decrease in the money supply will impact interest rates. And so then once you know, interest rate is basically the price of money. So just like when you have a supply and demand model for coffee, you know, supply of coffee goes up, what happens to prices? Supply of coffee goes down, what happens to prices? It's the same idea. So if the Fed were to increase the money supply, you can use this model to explain the change in the interest rate or the price of money. And then once you know what that change is, you can carry that forward into the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, where interest rates affect things like investment, which is part of aggregate demand, consumption, which is part of aggregate demand, and also has an impact on things like government spending and net exports to a degree as well. Mostly you'd probably focus on consumption and investment. That's where it has the biggest impact when the interest rate changes, but it can have an impact on all four. So I hope that answers your question, Carissa. Okay, so those are just that's just one example. There's also some other things listed in here in terms of models that you can use to talk about things like the Phillips curve, which is a little bit controversial sometimes among economists, but it is covered in our textbook. So that's the supposed trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and how maybe policy is trying to balance those two things. So that's something you could talk about as well in terms of the Fed's decisions. All right, so that's that one. Again, you might want more slides if you want to talk about different actions separately, if you don't want to cram it all into one slide. Most of your explanation is going to be in the notes area, whereas the slide will maybe list, you know, what the action was, what the tool used was, what the target rate they were going for, if that's what they were doing was specifically. And then if you're feeling really brave and want to really, you know, show off, I think this is a great thing to do and not much simpler than it would seem. You could even draw your own supply and demand of money model or your own aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to show the shift. So you could show the shift in the money supply in one, and then show the shift in aggregate demand in another, if you really want to do that. I think that would be cool. And you could, you know, flex your PowerPoint muscles too. Always fun. All right, so lastly, and this slide, this was the one that's missing a bullet point, but we'll talk about that to better reflect what's in the rubric. But this is, again, just like we had in fiscal policy impact. You're looking for what was the impact of the Fed's policy. So they obviously had an intended goal, which you talked a little bit about through your models. So, you know, they increased the money supply, and that was intended to somehow get the economy going, increase employment, increase GDP. The models explain why that thinking makes sense. But it doesn't always mean that it works out that way. So you can look at the data that you've already collected. You can look at research into these policies to see were they effective, or maybe were they effective but not as effective as they hoped to be? Was the timing off? Was the amount wrong? Was the direction totally wrong? So sometimes they can do really well and sometimes they cannot do well enough. There's a lot of talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy together. Maybe monetary policy wasn't as effective because fiscal policy would have been a better tool in that instance, and it just couldn't have as much impact as other tools. So that's something that research might indicate that you find as you learn more about the actions that the Fed took in your time period. And you'll also want to discuss, and this is the bullet point that's missing, so my apologies, but it is mentioned in your rubric. Look at how these things impacted households and businesses. So especially with monetary policy where they're impacting interest rates, what does that mean for people, you know, their day-to-day lives and the choices that they make based on that? And what does it mean for businesses as well? Obviously, when we look at macro and the aggregate, when we look at macro, we're looking at the aggregate. But that aggregate is based on lots of people and businesses making everyday decisions. So this is sort of your time to look at how these macro policies affect those of us down here at the micro level. And different groups might be impacted differently, so that's something to consider too. And this gives you some space to explore that a little bit. All right, and that's actually the last element. We just have those 3 content elements. Just like always, you will have a reference slide. At the very least, for this milestone, you need to have anything cited in the slide itself or in the notes show up on your full reference list. If you're including all the past slides so you can have one big document, your new sources that you're using here for these 3 slides can just get mixed in with the rest of your references. That's fine too. As long as your instructor can find anything cited with an in-text citation here on these 3 slides, as long as they can find it in the reference, you're good. And then you'll, of course, have a title slide if you're not using everything that came before it with your original title slide. That way it's got your name on it and everything. So I see maybe some questions coming through. Oh, you're welcome, Karen. Sorry, wasn't a question. So yeah, you guys just have 3 elements to tackle here. The Fed has such phenomenal resources that getting what you need shouldn't be too difficult, I hope. Hopefully by now, especially after last week's milestone, you're understanding the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model a little bit better. And you should be able to find research on the impact of all these policies because they're very well studied policy actions. I mean, heck, I'm sure that Ellen and anyone else, any other faculty who are still on the line will know, like, the Fed sneezes and it makes the news. So I keep seeing on the news all this stuff about the possible new Fed chair, and I swear even that gets some markets here and there moving, just the thought of who the next chair of the Federal Reserve might be. It's a very sensitive arena. People are always looking at it, reading between the lines of every announcement they make. So it's very well researched and studied. So there's plenty out there to find for any action they've taken. Yeah, it's crazy. Anytime they come out with new minutes, you'll see, like, if you read like the Wall Street Journal or something like that, there's always all these articles about what did it mean and what were they getting at when they said this. And so they have to be very, very careful with what they say publicly. Yeah, it's actually kind of amusing if you're into that. All right, well, if there's no other questions, you guys get 6 minutes back. And I wish you all very well on your milestones. I'm sure you'll do great. Please make sure to read through your chapter reading from the book so you have a solid understanding of what monetary policy is. Definitely use those links that are in here. Check out the Federal Reserve YouTube channel. That's a great resource. They have Fred, which is their database, but they also have their own YouTube channel where they have lots of educational videos just explaining this is what the Fed does and this is what our policies look like and this is what our tools mean and how we put those to work. So lots of great stuff on their YouTube page. So do check that out if you just want to get a better sense of what it all means. All right, good night.